Hi, my name is John Decker. Welcome to the Weekend Projects with John. This is something that I haven't done this format before with a whiteboard, but this morning I woke up and I was having coffee and I started having this idea that has been sort of percolating, coffee reference, in the back of my mind for quite some time. My wife really wants a greenhouse. And I know that she wants it for seed starting, but she also wants to try growing citrus here in Maine. Northern climate, citrus isn't really something that we have up here. Naturally, it doesn't overwinter well. And so having a greenhouse would allow her to grow a tree and overwinter it. And we've seen some videos on the internet, specifically on YouTube here, which show people doing exactly that in like Northern Dakota, for example. North Dakota, Northern Dakota, either way. So I've been thinking about creating a greenhouse for her for some time. There are several different variations that I have thought through. And for a while, I tried making a little mini greenhouse and wrapping it in like plastic. The plastic has deteriorated rather quickly, and I know that you have to buy special plastic that's UV stabilized to use for this. The other option is using polycarbonate extrusion, which is usually used, or you can buy it at the big box store, I guess, but it's usually used because it comes as kind of a corrugated plastic, which means that it is self-insulating, as well as creating a diffuse light. So when the sun passes through it, it creates a general ambient light rather than direct sunlight. And as far as I understand, which I am not an expert, general ambient light is better for plants than direct sunlight because of the lack of shade or the lack of direct shade that can be caused by direct sunlight. So I've been thinking for a long time now that if I were to make her a greenhouse, I would want to make it with polycarbonate panels. A lot of people have done polycarbonate panels for their greenhouse builds here on YouTube. And I haven't yet built her one. It's been 5 years, basically, since we've moved here. And she's been asking about it for a long time. I almost bought her one from Costco, but I'm kind of thinking that there's got to be a better way. A way that if we needed to, we could expand the greenhouse without having to tear it apart and rebuild it. And that's where my gaming habit comes in. I've been a PC gamer since I was 10 years old. And in more modern and more recent games that I've been playing, which are like online survival crafting games primarily, I'm an Ark player. Just get used to it. I do talk about Ark occasionally. In those games, all of the building components snap together and essentially create any configuration that you want based on a very core, simple set of components. And I was sitting at the coffee this morning, sitting at the kitchen table there, thinking about how I could make things that would require no tools to put them together. So that was one stipulation. And that would be flat packable so that if you wanted to store them somewhere in the building, you could do so in basically a box in the corner. And then as you needed for your build space or for your, burping up pickles. As you needed for your greenhouse space, you could add on to the existing design without really having to figure out how to tear off or cut anything or screw in anything. That's my limitation. I understand that that's probably not to building code. Code for building is hard to accommodate sometimes. But sometimes you need to just sort of create an idea to see if you can create something that is functional before figuring out whether or not you can create something that is both functional and works within the nuance of the existing systems. So the first part of this is designing something. I tend to do designs on paper still because for me, drawing on paper allows me to make mistakes without feeling like I need to be very precise in every single part of the design process. I've used Blender before for my 3D designs and modeling. I have a 3D printer. I very rarely use it because it takes so much more time for me to design in Blender or something like that, send it over to the printer, have it print something, find out if the print worked, find out if the print and the thing that I designed works in real life and is like structurally sound enough to work with what I do. when really I can just make something out of scrap material first, try it, see if it works, perfect the design from a structural standpoint, meaning like what does it do, and then have it made out of the better materials for a longer implementation. So if that's something that bothers you about the way that I build stuff here at the channel, know that most of the things that I've built here at the channel for the workshops, for example, or even some of the other crafty kind of things that I've done, I'm doing because they're only going to be a one-off. But something like what I'm discussing right now with this greenhouse design idea isn't a one-off. It's an idea where I want to create a panel, or potentially two panels, that can accommodate a wide array of configurations, which means those two panel designs have to be replicated over and over and over again. I'm going to start drawing on the board here to show some of what I'm talking about, but this format of me just talking to the camera about an idea, this is something that, to me anyways, allows me to get ideas out. I do not know if what I am about to draw on the board will actually work, and all I have is scribbles on a piece of paper literally from the coffee table this morning. But it is a process that is necessary in the design of a new product. And for me, it seems really something that I'm sick of seeing on YouTube, is where I get on YouTube and I watch somebody create something that I personally know they've spent hours and hours and hours and hours perfecting before they ever showed it on camera. That is great, but it makes it difficult for someone like me to do anything more than just buy it from them. What I want to do is create something that can be made by anybody, both in its physical reality as well as in its assembly. I would love to be able to give a box of material to a person and tell them, here you go, simple set of instructions. And the simple set of instructions is nothing more than a how to turn a key or how to latch a latch. In that sense, then, they are given full creative motivation to design their own building. So that's kind of where I'm going with this. Some of this might be reusing ideas that came before. I'm not trying to reinvent the wheel here. What I am trying to do is make something that feels, to me, like building in a video game, but in real life, and is solid, is safe, is functional, and relatively speaking, should be cheap. Some of the most costly points on a build, at least from my experience so far, isn't in the panels. It's in the screws. It's in the nails. It might be in the tools necessary to implement those screws or nails. And so if we can eliminate the need for screws and nails, if we can eliminate the need for saws and hammers and other things of that nature for small build projects like a greenhouse, then we can democratize the use of greenhouses on any scale. The scale I'll be working with today is amorphous right now. I don't know if I'll be going with millimeters and centimeters, which would make sense for easy math, or whether I'll go with feet and inches here in the US, because that's where I live. But I will show you the idea as it is right now. And this is something that I'm going to have as an ongoing series where I try a little bit about this idea every time. So here we go. The blue pen. This whiteboard, it gets messy pretty quick. It's not a good whiteboard. So the basic idea that I want to show you, what is the general outcome that we're looking to get to here, is the ability to have a traditionally shaped standard greenhouse, peak roof, or, I don't want to cross in front of the camera there, or a traditionally framed looking greenhouse with a roof that has a flat on the top. Either of these configurations needs to be able to be accomplished with the same materials. Also, if you're looking at the top down of this unit, for example, and you've got a roof line, we're going to make it as panel right side, that's the right side of the roof, i.e. here, and the left side of the roof, i.e. here, the possibility should be there that you could extend this section out in any configuration you wanted to, and have it work within the process of how these systems like hooked together. This might be more difficult to accomplish, but a single, say, for example, this is the front, or as you're walking in, this would be the door, for example. a front and a back that matches this format, and a side that matches the basic idea of most greenhouses with the peak roof, where you have your panel and your door, this section here, let's call it door here. Your door is here, and then the rest of the building could be in different, like it's an extended space. So this would be effectively like a 6x8 or, a 10x12 or whatever the component size needs to be to make this configuration work. Now on this configuration, which I'm inclined to like more, just the flat roof to me feels like you get more overhead space for the person walking in and out, but it also could be an issue if you have a place that snows a lot, so you may collect snow up there. This configuration here would be kind of the same deal. So you could have a door out front, right? And then your configuration essentially matching the same ideas going in and out, and then the extension going out this direction. And instead of it being a peak roof on the very top here, you would end up in a circumstance where, assuming this is the top of your building, here, you have angular slope on either side, and then a flat across the top here. And both of these configurations need to be able to use the exact same components in some form or fashion, just like a video game, to snap together and be built. So those are the basic ideas. Now the question is, how do we get to that point, and what are the sizes and shapes of those basic building block components that we could use to create this over and over and over again, no matter what configuration somebody wanted to slap together? Obviously, there would be design limitations. You're not going to get a curve out of this particular design. You might not be able to get something like this set up here with a pinnacle that ran all the way back to the original ridge line. That might not be possible, but I don't know yet. So we're going to find out together. This is going to be a long video, and I am going to use this whiteboard to ideate. The ideas that I come up with will be very rough. But my goal here, more than anything else, is to get my creative juices flowing and to let you in on the process of me coming up with this idea. Really want to create an end goal product here, because I really do want to create a greenhouse for my wife. But I wouldn't mind if somebody else liked the idea enough to expand on that idea and make it something that anybody could use. So let me wipe this off the board and see if it cleans off, and then we'll move on to the next step, which is talking about each individual component. I'm gonna have to get some alcohol wipes to fully clean this off, but that's okay for today. You get to see the ghost of the idea as we're going. All right, so the next thing on my list here was the first part of my idea, and that is to create those designs, we have to accommodate the door. And that sounds like maybe you shouldn't start with the door, you should start with the foundation, but we have to assume that the foundation will be a traditionally framed foundation. It could be cement blocks on the ground, it could be 4x4 posts laid out with gravel poured in. All of the traditional ways of securing a building to the ground, those will have to be normal. They can't be something that's flat packed. And the reason for that is we could create this, we can make this flat packable and anchored to the ground. That's effectively what you find if you go and grab one of those aluminum extrusion and polycarbonate extrusion greenhouses off of Amazon right now. You can build that thing, but it's not really tied to the ground with a foundation. You still have to make a foundation or anchor it some way. And that is outside the premise of what we're trying to create today. Because frankly speaking, I don't want to get into the point where we're trying to figure out a way to redesign the wheel or reinvent the wheel. I think the foundation, that seems to be pretty solid as far as I'm concerned. So we'll ignore the fact that the foundation is something separate from what we're developing here. And what we're developing here is just the interlocking components, okay? And so one of those interlocking component premises is how to create the door. Now the door being the most complex part, realistically, doors and windows are the most complex part of the greenhouse designs. The door has to be able to have two things. One, it has to have hinges so that it can swing. And two, it has to have a handle. And I personally am in favor of doors that are not one big swing door. Like barn doors have effectively a French door design. So they meet in the middle and then they swing open. And the reason that I'm in favor of that is because in the design of the greenhouse, if you have a door that swings from the middle, like opens up wide like that, then you can accommodate a wider door with less room to open the doors, right? And all you have to do is make sure that that seam in the middle, when it's shut, is solid enough to keep the temperature variance from the outside to the inside, so that that insulation factor of polycarbonate isn't lost with all of these gaps in your doors. So we'll talk about that in just a second, but I'm going to go with a split door design on this because it accommodates some of the component sizes we'll be discussing. So the door, assume the door has hinges and that there's a split down the middle and that it's opening essentially like a cabinet, or like I said, like a French door. This door here, the panels that make up either door need to be made up of the same components that make up the walls or potentially the roof, because we want to eliminate the component list. In other words, we need to keep it as simple as possible here in the construction process. The only thing that we need to then accommodate in the door itself that is different than the rest of the build is where to attach the hinges and where to attach the handles. And that part I have yet to figure out. So we'll go with this as a thing that we need to figure out, but let's discuss these panels and that will show you how this kind of is going to work out. So first off, we assume that most individuals will want a greenhouse that has a door tall enough to accommodate at least a 6 foot, potentially a 6'5" individual. I am 6 foot barely. I might be 5'11". As I get older, I get shorter. That's what my dad said. All right, so here's how we make the panel, or here's the basic idea of the panel anyhow. The panel needs to be approximately 1 unit. We'll say a foot because I'm here in the US, but 1 unit is probably the best way to think of that. With the bottom section of that same panel also being 1 unit. So you could think of this as being like a square foot if it were to go all the way across, but it doesn't. It turns into a triangle. So what we're essentially looking at here, let's say I'm going to use my measurements that I took earlier just to give you some context here, and we're going to do it in centimeters so that I can use the math that I already did. But let's say this is 61 centimeters, and that's close to 2 feet. So I really would prefer this be half of that size, but we'll just do it off of this for now so you can kind of get an idea for where I was going with it. 61 centimeters and 61 centimeters, making this one here, or panel C, if you think of this as A, B, and C, being 86.267 centimeters, right? Now, the reason we want to do this is because having a design for a greenhouse specifically, or frankly, any building that has a 90 degree and then 245s becomes very structurally sound in the wind. And that's another thing I do not like about the greenhouses that you can buy on Amazon that are just aluminum and polycarbonate slapped together. They don't have lateral or angular structure oftentimes. And the most common comments that are negative that I see are it blows over or it falls apart in high winds. So if we've got a design that is effectively a triangle like this with a 90 degree on one, 45s and 45s, then we end up in a circumstance where if you want to create a square, you have 2 components. So the components are effectively identical to create the square. So you have a square. This seems pretty simple to me and pretty obvious, but we'll go through it anyways. You have a square panel here. And if you consider what we were talking about with the door earlier, we could come down to this door and assume this is a 61 inch or 61 centimeter across. So your 161 centimeter increment here, and we'd probably want to flip the angular for reasons, if you don't understand how gates lean on their hinges, the best way to keep your gate or your door from creaking on its hinge is to make sure that any of its weight is sent back to the hinge side of the door. And so in this instance, if you were going to do that with this door, you would want all of your angular pieces here to lean back or send their weight essentially back to the door frame itself. So on the left side door panel, this angular piece would send its weight back to the hinge, and on the right side door panel to be the exact same pieces but inverted. And so you would have your angular piece sending its weight back to the hinge. And in this instance, if you could assume that 61 centimeters is approximately 24 inches, so like 2 feet, then to make a 6-foot door, you would have 3 of these pairings on each side. Now, a 6-foot door is what you're going to find if you look at small greenhouse designs on, like I said, Amazon or maybe even Costco. And so in this instance, you're going to want to have your weight or your angles running both ways just to keep that from squeaking or torquing too much. Again, this design allows the panels on both sides, right and left of each of these door pieces, to be made up of the same component. So you could assume that to send out a door as a thing, or to build a door as a thing, you would end up creating 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. I should have been able to do that in my head, but I'm getting cold. 12 individual components like this in a box. Or, like I said, somewhere in the back of your barn, you could have these all stacked up and they can just go together like they do in a video game. And now you've got a door. Handle on the front could be done by potentially having a stick-ons thing. I honestly don't know how to do the handle yet, but then the hinge point on the side could be simple enough by having, however these panels, like whatever the edge material is made up out of these, having that have a pinhole on the top and bottom on every single point of this. So like the corner, for example, up here on every single one would have a little pinhole, and the corner, and same thing on the other side essentially, right? And so you would end up in a circumstance where your pinhole would accommodate however you wanted to orient these. So you could have windows and you could have doors, and they would all be something that could be accommodated just by having a pinhole built into the very end of those frames, or however that is designed. Okay, so we now know that within the design of the frame itself, or if you could consider this like a solid, let's assume it was, as simple as possible. It's not an assembly that you have to put together. It might be something that is completely uniform, but I don't know that part yet. This has a pinhole on every corner looking in at a 90-degree angle. That's a possibility. I don't know that that's going to work, but that's a possibility. Again, this is an idea. So that's one potential for making a door that could swing open. So as far as sealing these units together, because again, I'm thinking greenhouse, we need to make it so that each line, each edge of the panel has a seal built into it. So when they get locked together, however they get locked together, we're going to talk about that in a second, they seal. And that way you're not having to put on like seam tape, you're not having to put on extra caulk, anything like that. Every single side that could touch another side as part of the framework or as part of the door has a seam built into it that seals. Might be rubber, might be plastic, I don't know yet, but that's the premise we're going to work with here. Let's go over to this design. Now, if you were to build a framework like I had shown earlier, where you have the traditional front, and this is I'm using this idea because it's something that I see so commonly available already, and a fully pitched, I think it's called a 12-12 roof. So it's basically a 45-degree angle. And then you want this door in the middle. Size is going to be, I'm not doing this to scale. You want this door in the middle to go up high, right? So that you can accommodate a 6-foot door in a, say, for example, well, I'm trying to think. On this scale, it's hard to see, but let's assume this was that each one of these, instead of being 2 foot across, was 1 foot across. You could do a door like this in 4 foot wide space. Obviously 6 foot would be preferable, but 4 foot wide space. Have a door that is effectively a 24-inch door, split seam, like we discussed earlier. And then each one of these component panels would be 1 foot, 1 square foot if you wanted to think of it that way, all the way to the top, and then this peak here. So now you end up in a circumstance where an angular panel like this accommodates both of these positions, and it accommodates this position here, and the door, we'll just discuss the door as being this long thing in the middle. It could be any height realistically within this format. And the same on the other side. You kind of get the idea that we're going for here. And now the component list that you've created, or that we've created here in this design, is accommodated by, we have 12 panels here. We have 10 panels making up this section here. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 on either side. So 18 panels. They're just the same panel over and over and over again. See why this could be kind of nice to have? The only limitation now then is the roof. And when I say limitation, I know there's a lot of variables that will have to go into this and how they lock together, and that'll be a part of how I get into this design. This is a long video. But the roof then becomes something a little bit different. We're following along with this pattern, but we're going to have to do the same thing on the roof. Because what I'd like to make it into is something that if I handed it to someone, they wouldn't have to learn a totally new skill set for every section of the building. The whole building goes together the same way. So let's talk about the roof. Now the roof line is made up of if you want to think of this as side A, side B, and then side C, the roof line is made up of the long side, side C, running traversely or transversely, or however you want to think of that. So if we consider this point here and this point here to be here and here, and we run that down the line of the greenhouse design, and accommodating this specific length here, you could assume then from this drawing that this piece right here, this length here, and this piece right here, that length there, are both the 86.267, or like I said, half of that if you're doing 1 foot squares or 1 foot triangles, right? And so let's assume it's an 86.267 split. You end up with 2 sections here, and this is where I wanted it to be something where the accommodation at the wall level, which we have to assume the wall is made up of all of these same 1x1 components essentially, or 61 by 61 components. You would assume then that the wall, being just a rectangular construction down this side, for example, I'm just going to make a line here to demonstrate what I'm talking about, is made up of all of these panels that are essentially, ignore the scale, obviously it's a little bit off, but they're all essentially the same size. So they're going to be 61s. I'm not going to draw all the lines in, but 61s across there. Well, this panel on the top has to accommodate 61 on the bottom level. So we'll draw another angle here. We're going to go with let's do it up here. So we'll just do it as a demonstration, right? So you have 61 on the bottom. That would be this section right there, goes here. But the length of these has to be, this section here has to be 86, let's do this reference point, 86.267, roughly. And again, I'm probably gonna half all these, but so this component is longer on side A. So this is side A, and then side B. And now we have this extra long angle piece coming down, just like we did on part number 1 here. So part number 2 has a 61-inch length on the bottom, 86.267 along the left-hand side wall, and then side C, as it were here, is 105.655 centimeters. All right, now that kind of describes the only component you would actually need to produce or make, and you could just rep them out over and over and over again, is this component for roofs and this component for walls and doors and windows. And if the roof component needed to open for any reason at all, you could also have the roof component have the hinge points somewhere in it. So you might have, for example, since some greenhouses accommodate this idea, you might have this panel here, for example, be a window that can open, or preferable be up here somewhere. But I actually am in favor of having the sections here at the front of the building be a part of that potential. There are a lot of limitations. I'm not going to say that this is a custom design that's going to work for every single thing out there, but I will say that this design, from my perspective anyways, allows for a very easy assembly, assuming that those parts that we've just kind of referenced here can go together in a way that makes sense to anybody, even if somebody is unfamiliar with tools. Normally, when you're getting a part list from a online greenhouse kit, it's going to come with nuts and bolts. You might need a wrench. You might need a screwdriver. If you have one that's made out of wood, it might come with lag bolts. It might come with screws. You're going to need a screwdriver at least, more likely a drill. These are all component things that are common for me to use, but somebody who has never used them before might be looking at that list of materials like it's an IKEA design with no instructions. I would like to hand something to someone and be like, this box includes all of the parts. And the parts are, as they open the box, just these things. And the only tool they would need is potentially something that looks exactly like a key, i.e. a turnkey system, or they don't need any tools at all, and all they need is their thumb. So I'm not really sure which is a better idea. I'm in favor of the turnkey because it gives you some torque that you can really tension things into place with. But again, this is the first time I've ever talked about this idea. I literally had it at the coffee table this morning. So let's go through this design as an idea, and I'll get this on recording, and hopefully this all makes sense. This probably should have been done as a live stream. All right, so let's clear the board, all of this stuff, and let's talk about how to make this work. Now, this is the part that I don't know how to do yet. I have some ideas, but I don't know what's going to work. And I'll have to try it first before I actually put something into practice. Here we go. Every single panel, whether it's the long panel or the short panel, every single panel needs to have universal intersection points. That way it can be put together in any configuration, regardless of which side is facing which direction. So with that in mind, we're going to just talk about the sidewall of each of these panels as though it were one thing. And I'm going to draw it really big so I can see it here. And I don't know if it's showing up because my pen's getting a little cold. All right. Okay. Now we're going to make the assumption that this section of the panel up here in the distance, as it were, continues on as the polycarbonate panel. And polycarbonate can come in a variety of different widths. My hope is that if I'm creating a greenhouse, I'm giving myself about an inch between the exterior and the interior polycarbonate extrusion. And the reason for that has to do with insulation factor of air gapping. There is a lot to be said for you get narrower, you're going to lose a lot more of your heat. There's potential to be making this a little bit more expensive by having double extrusions on either side, but I feel like this best fits the idea of having about an inch of workable space. And the reason for that has to do with how they latch together, how I think they're going to have to latch together. So along the sidewall on the we're calling it the leading edge because it's facing us, but also consider that anything I draw on this has to be mirrored on the other side. So anything that I'm building here has to, in my opinion, in order to fit into a box and be less likely to get damaged when you're storing it, it needs to be able to be flush and flat like it is right now while it's in storage. So no weird things sticking off the edge that might hang on something or bend or any of that. I don't want it to be possible as long as it was, stored properly. I don't want anything to be able to be broken easily without it, being something that you just didn't store it properly. Okay, so the idea that I think is going to work to make this functional is to create a latch that is nothing more than a circle or a half circle in a sense, okay? And the reason for that is it allows both sides, the leading component here and the part that it's going to meet up with, to have the same slots and the same position and material-wise contain the same stuff. So let's pretend that this is we're going to just draw one component essentially here. We're going to assume then that you need something to come out. Actually, we'll come back to this, I promise. This is your extrusion. This is a big one. We need something to come out and lock into its neighbor, right? So assume this is your wall, your line, you're attaching it to something else. And so you need something to come out of your existing wall and go into a pin slot or a slot of some sort and lock in. Now, again, if you're buying this online, you're not buying what I'm building, but you're buying something else, you're going to find yourself in a circumstance where you might have two aluminum frames. They match up with each other. There's usually a bolt they send through, and then there's a fixture on one side, either the bolt head itself or a wing nut usually, and then they'll have you just twist those things together so that you push these two frames tightly together. But now you're looking at the frames themselves. You're looking at least two, if not three components in the actual fittings, or what do they call them? I've lost the word, but basically the bolts and the nuts. If the nuts and the bolts are a part of this, then they are an expense and a material that can get lost. And we want to be making this so that it can be taken down and put together as commonly and as frequently as possible, not just for my own situation here, but you might want to have a field pop-up that you can throw together a whole bunch of greenhouse designs or greenhouse components at sizes as small as 1 foot by 1 foot with a frame on top, right? Little tiny coverings for every single box in your garden or out in the field somewhere. And then when those sprouts are ready to rock, bring it off, stack it in the corner somewhere. It needs to be super robust. So instead of having a whole bunch of bolts and nuts and screws and things that you've got to deal with, tools and all that stuff, eliminate all of that and create a tension latch instead. So in the idea here would be that something comes out of the frame on one side, comes out of the frame, goes into the other frame, and in its process of going into the other frame, locks that other frame against the first frame with enough tension that it's not peeling apart. Also, we can do this simply enough by, we can make it so that one thing slides into the other thing like a cookie essentially, and that way it doesn't, move laterally from itself, but we need it to both be locked in for this position, but also locked in for like turning or torquing or potentially being pulled apart. So we want to be able to lock it not just this way, but also this way. The bolts do that. They do that very well. They're very good, but there's a lot of potential for loss and damage and frankly, misalignment and misdesign. So let's assume that this scribbling makes any sense at all. And I'll show you what I came up with over a little bit of coffee this morning. What we're going to do, or what I think would be good to do, would be to create a shape. See if I can do this with my hands freezing out like I am right now. That's roughly this. Now, if you're a tooling design person, you're probably like, what in the world? But let's just make it a very sans serif eye. Now, if you know where this is going, don't tell anybody yet. There could be a pin in the middle. I'm thinking that might be a good idea. But for now, there's no real way for what I'm about to describe to accidentally fall out, even if there's no pin there. And that's good. Now on the sidewall here, now I'm going to get to what this is, I promise. But on the sidewall, you have to have something basically the same. Because remember, each one of these components needs to be able to be locked together in any 90-degree configuration from itself. And if you're talking about like the roof line that we were discussing as a separate part, you want the roof line to have these slots so that they can match up with the angle, as it were, portion of any given wall piece. So what's in here? Well, let's leave that up there and assume this. I know my perspective is off on the ones on the side, but assume this is married on the other side with the one that is identical. What's inside that thing that makes this work? So I'm making a really big one so I can kind of draw into it to make this make sense. So assume that this is also over here somewhere. Alongside the left-hand side, or the closest to the corner side of each of these panels, there needs to be a slot like this, and it's built into the panel itself. Now, there's a reason that this could be something that I would see as a failure point. If you were telling someone, hey, you can lock this all together and it'll work. But if you want to really make it solid and you want to make it like permanent, essentially, you're going to have to, have a cap or a fill or something that you can fill this slot with if it's on the outside of the building. It shouldn't be an issue depending on how the materials are put together and what the materials actually are, or even realistically how close those tolerances are for what I'm about to discuss. but there's a potential there that could be considered a penetration point for water or something of that nature. Okay, so this little slot, what does it do? Well, it exists on both the incoming panel and on the receiving panel identically. So keep this in mind, but I'm going to draw a line down the middle. These are two panels coming together. This slot is going to be somewhere in here, for example, right? You're not going to see it because it's between the two panels. And there's this little arc that's essentially an open space on both sides. What is that arc? Inside of that arc is a pinhole or a hole, keyhole as it were, in the latching component that I think would be best here. So we're going to assume that this that I'm designing here, that I'm showing on the side, is an X-ray of what's inside of this section here. Okay? So I'm going to draw it here so you can kind of get a vibe for it. Inside of this slot is a component that essentially fills that slot almost all the way up. If your tolerance is tight enough, it would probably be a good idea to fill it all the way up. Okay? But what is that? That is a circle. Technically, it's a half circle. All the way around. My circles are not good, so ignore the fact that that looks more like a boob. All right? And then on the outside of that circle is a thicker line of the same material, just like this. These two things, they need to be perfect circles. And I understand I'm not a very good drawer in that sense, especially at a left side. This slot is, and should be, representing the turn that these latches, that's what they are, can make. So for example, if you took a key, the design of the key being something to there's a key, I promise, something akin to this. So that would be your key. It would just be like a normal key on one side, but it'd have two, like a fork on the other side. You stick your key into this hole, into these slots, and just turn it, quarter turn. And now you've quarter turned both of these grooved circles, I don't know what to call them, into a position that now makes them look like this. Okay? So I'm going to use a quick mark here. Let's assume this is where the keyhole went in, and that's another keyhole there. Now you can match it up over here and know that they are there, right? So you've essentially done a half turn, and you've shifted this meaty section of the circle around halfway to meet. It's essentially now part of the other part of the building, or the other part of the panel rather. And this groove on the top, on both sides of the incoming and the receiver, those grooves need to be lined up perfectly for this to work. Now, that's the flat version of this. I think the torquing version of this is effectively the same deal, except that as you pull together the two components, there is some form of torque that tensions. It could be a slope in the design, I'm not really sure yet, but torque that tensions these two pieces together. And so that's the part I need to come up with. But I think that this design allows for the panel's latch mechanism to sit inside of the frame itself and actually have three latches in each frame position. And those positions can be equidistant on the frame itself, so that no matter whether you're doing an upright or a lateral or even an angular piece, all of your latches match. So that you can use, if you wanted to, I don't know what the design would be, but if you wanted to set up a design that used the half-size panels as roof points, you could do that. You may not have, you might have some spots which there might be a gap because of the size differences there, but the actual latching mechanisms would match. It has to be as universal as possible here. And that way, the only tool that you need technically would be this keyhole. Now, if you wanted to do it without a key, could that be possible? I think you could. I think it would require that the components themselves have a little push tab or a little like extrusion, so that the arch that you're seeing that's used as that key turning mechanism would be more like this. So be a wider space, be a solid plastic or something in there. Or it might actually just be that you can physically get to the surface of this material, so it's extruded to the same level as the external arc, the external meat of the latch. And then it would have a little thumb tab built into it with some knurling on it or something, right? And so you could just thumb tab that into space. If you did both of them at the same time, you could do that. I prefer the key because it requires you only to have one hand. Some people don't have two hands, but it could be either one of these. And that design would allow the two pieces to lock together. And because it's a perfect circle, there is no point other than this very seam where that circle is slip ready. In other words, there's enough of an angle on either side of the seam that it doesn't pull apart this way because it has to be perfectly aligned. So that's my thought. And now that I'm thinking about it, if the exterior here, if you want to call it the meat that we keep discussing, if the exterior is tapered from the leading edge here all the way back, if it's tapered thin to high and also thin to wide, right? Then as you're pulling it together, as you're going in, it's a little bit easier. And as you go further and further and further, it's pulling it together tighter. That could be a way to make this work simply. So there would be tolerance for a little bit of a gap at the very beginning of the turn. And then as you tightened it down, really locking it down to that half turn point, then it's tightened all the way up. So that's my design, and that's how I think it should go together. If this seems more complex than just going out there and hammering and nailing something together, you're right. Designing something in advance that could make something much simpler later on, the R&D part, that's complex. That's why it takes so long for a lot of products to come out. Because now I've got to go through and create something like this out of materials that I have at my disposal that I can do. And I understand I could go 3D print something. That's not worth it to me because I really just want to see, is this something that could be made out of simple materials? If I can make it out of simple materials, it can be made out of any materials. So that's the design. That's the idea. And that is what I came up with over coffee this morning. And guys and girls and whoever else watches this, I just want you to know, every project that I do here, whether it's working on hangers for my workshop cleat wall, whether it's working on scratchers for my cats, whether it's building or redesigning or, whatever the wood stove. I'm just trying to think of things that I've already done here so you can get an example going here. All of those things that sound like, man, he really didn't do his research before he started. That's partially true. I am trying to do stuff here on this channel that I've never done before. Because to me, that is part of the experience. That's part of the adventure. It's literally a part of the journey for building this channel. So if ideas like this intrigue you and you want to see them tried and you don't mind the journey and you don't just need instant gratification of it's done, let me buy it, then follow and subscribe because that's the kind of content you're going to get on this channel. I appreciate you following along this far. If you got to the end here, please like and subscribe. My name is John Decker, and this has been a Weekend Project with John.